The thermometer outside read -37 degrees, cold enough to freeze a man's breath before it left his lungs. Inside the log cabin built deep within the lava tube cave, Thaddeus Merrick sat in his shirt sleeves beside a fire no larger than a cooking flame, the interior holding steady at 72 degrees. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale might just change how you see survival itself. The morning of December 9th, 1842, Thaddeus Merrick woke to silence. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to coals sometime during the night, and the cabin interior held the bitter cold that came with high-altitude winters in the Idaho Territory. He could see his breath forming clouds in the dim pre-dawn light filtering through the single oiled paper window. The temperature inside the cabin felt barely warmer than the frozen world outside. Thaddeus pulled his buffalo robe tighter and turned toward the sleeping platform where his trapping partner, Ephraim Doyle, should have been stirring. Ephraim was an early riser, usually awake before Thaddeus, already building up the fire and putting coffee on to boil. But the platform was still, too still. Thaddeus rose from his own sleeping robes and crossed the small cabin in 3 steps. His boots crunched on frost that had formed on the dirt floor during the night. He reached Ephraim's platform and knew immediately that something was wrong. His partner lay curled beneath 2 heavy blankets and a beaver pelt robe, but he wasn't shivering. He wasn't moving at all. Thaddeus touched Ephraim's shoulder. The body was rigid, frozen solid beneath the coverings. For several minutes, Thaddeus stood motionless, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Ephraim Doyle had survived 4 winters in the mountains. He was 43 years old, experienced, careful, and strong. He had weathered blizzards, survived encounters with grizzly bears, and once walked 30 miles through snow with a broken ankle to reach a trading post. Men like Ephraim didn't simply freeze to death inside their own cabins. But the evidence was undeniable. Thaddeus forced himself to move, to think practically. He rebuilt the fire, not for warmth now, but because he needed light and something to do with his hands. As the flames grew, he examined the cabin with new awareness. The gaps between the logs where chinking had fallen out, the thin spots in the mud daubing that let wind whistle through, the inadequate door that fit poorly in its frame, the single-layer roof that provided shelter from snow but no real insulation against cold. They had burned through an enormous amount of firewood over the past 5 days. Thaddeus had noticed it but hadn't worried. Wood was abundant in the surrounding forest. They could always cut more. But now, looking at Ephraim's frozen body, he understood that the quantity of firewood wasn't the issue. The cabin itself was the problem. It was a shelter, but it was not truly protection. It kept the snow off their heads, but it couldn't keep them alive when temperatures dropped below a certain threshold. Thaddeus had fed that fire throughout the night. He remembered waking twice to add logs, stoking it high because the cold was so intense. Despite those efforts, despite a fire large enough to illuminate the entire interior, the cabin had still frozen, and Ephraim had died. Thaddeus buried Ephraim on a hillside overlooking their trap lines. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep, and it took him most of 2 days to dig through the iron-hard earth with a pickaxe and shovel. He piled stones over the grave to keep wolves and bears from disturbing it, then returned to the cabin alone. The solitude gave him time to think, and what he thought about was mathematics. Specifically, the mathematics of survival through a mountain winter. The calculations were brutally simple and utterly damning. He sat at the rough-hewn table with a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of birch bark and began working through the numbers. A fire large enough to keep the cabin marginally warm required approximately 8 logs per hour during the coldest nights. That meant 192 logs per day. The winter season in this elevation lasted roughly 5 months, from November through March. 5 months equaled 150 days. 150 days at 192 logs per day meant 28,800 logs. Thaddeus stared at the number. 28,800 logs, Even accounting for warmer days when less fire was needed, even splitting the difference and calling it 20,000 logs, the quantity was staggering. Each log had to be cut, limbed, hauled to the cabin, and split into burnable pieces. 2 men working full-time could perhaps cut and process 50 logs per day if they did nothing else. That meant 400 days of work just to gather enough firewood for one winter. But trappers couldn't spend 400 days cutting wood. They had to run trap lines, process pelts, hunt for food, maintain equipment, and do dozens of other tasks necessary for survival. In practice, they might manage to gather 3,000 to 4,000 logs before winter set in, which meant they were always operating with a deficit, always running short, always cold. The inefficiency was obvious once Thaddeus framed it this way. They weren't really heating themselves. They were heating the entire outdoors, with a tiny fraction of that heat remaining inside the cabin long enough to provide temporary comfort. The cabin walls were sieves. Heat poured through every gap, every crack, every poorly fitted joint. It radiated through the thin roof. It escaped through the inadequate door. They might as well have been trying to heat the forest itself. Other trappers accepted this as normal. Cold was simply part of mountain life. You froze in winter. You burned enormous amounts of wood. You woke up to ice inside your cabin. You accepted the risk that a particularly brutal night might kill you in your sleep. This was the trade-off for freedom and profit in the fur trade. But Ephraim's death had stripped away Thaddeus's ability to accept these conditions as inevitable. His partner hadn't died from bad luck or carelessness. He had died from faulty infrastructure. The cabin had failed at its most basic purpose, keeping its occupants alive. Thaddeus began visiting other trappers' camps over the following weeks, ostensibly to inform them of Ephraim's death, but actually to observe their living conditions. What he found confirmed his analysis. Everyone was struggling with the same problem, and no one had a solution. January of 1843 was exceptionally cold. Thaddeus continued running his trap lines alone, but the work had become secondary to his growing obsession with thermal efficiency. He started carrying a brass thermometer he had purchased years earlier from a Street Louis trading company. The instrument had seemed frivolous at the time, a curiosity with no practical value. Now it became his most important tool. He measured everything. The temperature outside at dawn, at midday, at dusk, at midnight. The temperature inside his cabin at the same intervals. The temperature near the fire versus the temperature in the corners. The temperature near the floor versus near the ceiling. He recorded these measurements on birch bark with charcoal, creating a detailed picture of how heat moved through his living space. The numbers told a discouraging story. On a morning when the outside temperature was minus 22 degrees, the cabin interior measured 18 degrees near the cold corners, 26 degrees near the walls, and 48 degrees within 3 feet of the fire. The average interior temperature was perhaps 30 degrees. To keep from freezing, Thaddeus had to stay close to the fire continuously, which made productive work nearly impossible. He visited a trapper named Jasper Flint, who had a cabin 8 miles south. Jasper was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who had been working the Rocky Mountain region for nearly 2 decades. His cabin was larger than Thaddeus's, built with thicker logs and more careful chinking. Surely, Thaddeus thought, an experienced mountain man like Jasper would have developed techniques for staying warm. But Jasper's cabin was just as cold. He kept an enormous fire burning constantly, consuming wood at a ferocious rate, and still the interior barely reached tolerable temperatures. Jasper accepted this as normal. He wore heavy furs inside his own cabin and slept in buffalo robes piled 4 deep. When Thaddeus asked if he had ever considered alternative building methods, Jasper looked at him as if he had suggested flying to the moon. "This is how cabins are built," Jasper explained. "You stack logs, you chink the gaps, you build a fire. There was no other way. Men had been building cabins this way for generations. If there was a better method, someone would have discovered it already." Thaddeus visited 2 more trappers over the next week. Both had similar cabins, similar problems, and similar acceptance of cold as an unavoidable reality. None of them questioned the fundamental design. They simply endured. But Thaddeus couldn't endure any more. Ephraim's frozen body haunted him. The wastefulness of burning vast quantities of wood to achieve minimal warmth offended his sense of reason. There had to be a better approach. The problem was that he had no idea what that approach might be. He knew nothing about advanced construction techniques. He had built exactly 3 structures in his life, 2 cabins and a small barn back in Ohio before he had come west. He had no engineering training, no architectural knowledge, no exposure to anything beyond the most basic frontier carpentry. He was simply a trapper who was tired of freezing and convinced that men smarter than him must have solved this problem somewhere. On February 3, 1843, Thaddeus tracked a small herd of elk into a section of foothills he rarely visited. The terrain was rough, broken by volcanic rock formations that made travel difficult and offered poor trapping opportunities. He normally avoided this area, but the elk had led him several miles from his usual territory, and he followed more out of restlessness than genuine hunting intent. The elk disappeared into a narrow canyon between 2 ridges of black volcanic stone. Thaddeus followed on foot, leading his horse through scattered pines and around boulders of dark, porous rock. The canyon walls rose 40 feet on either side, composed entirely of this volcanic material. The stone was rough-textured, filled with tiny air pockets, lightweight despite its apparent solidity. Halfway up the canyon, Thaddeus noticed an opening in the rock wall. It was large, approximately 15 feet wide and 10 feet high, like a massive doorway carved into the mountainside. He approached cautiously, unsure if the cave might shelter a bear or mountain lion. He called out and listened for sounds of animal occupation. Hearing nothing, he picked up a stone and threw it into the darkness. It clattered somewhere deep inside, the echo suggesting significant depth. Thaddeus lit a pine torch and entered carefully. The cave was not a simple hollow in the rock. It was a tunnel extending straight back into the mountain with remarkable uniformity. The walls were smooth compared to typical cave formations, rounded rather than jagged. The ceiling maintained a consistent height of approximately 12 feet. The floor was relatively level, covered with a layer of fine volcanic sand and small stones. He walked 50 feet into the tunnel, then 100 feet. The passage showed no signs of narrowing. At 150 feet, his torch illuminated what appeared to be a curve ahead, the tunnel bending slightly to the right. The air was still, but not stale. He felt a faint movement of air on his face, suggesting the tunnel had ventilation somewhere deeper inside. What struck Thaddeus most forcefully was the temperature. Outside, the February afternoon was brutally cold, well below 0. Inside the tunnel, the air felt noticeably warmer. He pulled off his heavy glove and touched the stone wall. It was cool but not freezing. He held his bare hand in the air. The temperature was comfortable enough that he could stand there without gloves and not feel pain from cold. Thaddeus returned to the entrance and checked his thermometer. Outside temperature, -14 degrees. He walked back into the tunnel to the 100-foot mark and checked again. Inside temperature, 48 degrees. He stared at the instrument, thinking he must have misread it. 62 degrees warmer inside the tunnel than outside, with no fire, no insulation, nothing but stone. Thaddeus returned to the lava tube the following morning with supplies. He brought his thermometer, a notebook made from stitched birch bark, charcoal for writing, his bedroll, 3 days of food, and a determination to understand what he had discovered. If the cave maintained warmth without fire, he needed to know if that warmth was consistent or merely a temporary anomaly. He set up a simple camp just inside the cave entrance where daylight still provided adequate illumination. The location allowed him to monitor both the interior environment and the outside conditions simultaneously. He drove a wooden stake into the ground at the entrance and hung his thermometer from it, then placed a second thermometer on a rock ledge 100 feet inside the tunnel. The first day of observation yielded remarkable data. Outside temperature at dawn, -21 degrees. Inside temperature At the same time, 49 degrees. A 70-degree difference. As the sun rose and the outside air warmed slightly to -8 degrees by midday, the interior temperature remained essentially unchanged at 48 degrees. By sunset, when outside temperatures plunged again to -26 degrees, the cave interior registered 47 degrees. The pattern was unmistakable. The cave maintained a nearly constant temperature regardless of external conditions. Thaddeus spent the first night inside the tunnel to experience the environment directly. He built no fire, wanting to eliminate any variable that might affect his observations. He simply laid out his bedroll on the sandy floor and wrapped himself in blankets. The night was surprisingly comfortable. The still air meant no wind chill. The stable temperature meant no gradual cooling that forced him to add layers or wake shivering. He slept better than he had in months, waking naturally at dawn rather than from cold-induced discomfort. The second day brought a weather change. Snow fell heavily outside, driven by strong winds. The outside temperature rose slightly to -12 degrees, moderated by cloud cover and storm conditions. Inside the cave, the temperature registered 48 degrees, unchanged. Thaddeus walked deeper into the tunnel, measuring temperature every 50 feet. At 200 feet, 47 degrees. At 300 feet, 48 degrees. At 400 feet, 49 degrees. The deeper sections were actually slightly warmer, though the difference was minimal. He touched the walls at various points, noting that the volcanic rock felt uniformly cool but never cold. The stone itself seemed to be maintaining the temperature, as if the entire mountain was a massive storage system for heat. He had no technical understanding of geothermal principles, but his practical observations told him everything he needed to know. The earth itself was warm. Below the surface, insulated by layers of rock, temperatures remained stable regardless of seasonal changes. On the third day, Thaddeus conducted a final experiment. He built a small fire near the cave entrance using deadfall wood he collected from the canyon. The fire burned for 2 hours, raising the local temperature around it to approximately 90 degrees. He then extinguished the fire and monitored how quickly the heat dissipated. Within 1 hour, the area had returned to 48 degrees. The cave absorbed the excess heat and redistributed it into the massive thermal mass of surrounding stone. Thaddeus packed his supplies and returned to his cabin with his measurements and a growing conviction that he had found the solution to his problem. The cabin felt unbearably cold after 3 nights in the lava tube. Thaddeus built up his fire and sat at his table, spreading out his birch bark notes. The numbers were indisputable. A natural shelter existed that maintained temperatures 70 degrees warmer than the outside air without any fuel consumption whatsoever. The implications were staggering. If he built a cabin inside the lava tube, he would be starting from a baseline of 48 degrees instead of -20 degrees. The amount of firewood needed to raise interior temperature from 48 to a comfortable 65 or 70 degrees would be a fraction of what was required to achieve the same result starting from sub-zero conditions. He could survive winter on 1/10 the firewood he currently burned, possibly less. The idea seemed almost too simple. Yet, no one was doing it. Trappers built cabins in clearings, near water sources, in locations convenient for accessing trap lines. They accepted cold as inevitable and compensated with enormous fires and heavy clothing. None of them had apparently considered building inside natural shelters. Thaddeus spent the next week thinking through practical challenges. The lava tube entrance was 15 feet wide and 10 feet high. A cabin 12 feet wide and 14 feet deep would fit comfortably with room to spare. The floor would require leveling, but the volcanic sand and gravel could be shaped with reasonable effort. Logs would have to be hauled into the cave, but the entrance was large enough to accommodate that task. Chimney design presented the most significant challenge. A cabin inside a cave needed ventilation to prevent smoke accumulation. The cave itself had natural air movement, suggesting ventilation somewhere in the tunnel system. A properly designed chimney could exhaust into the cave space, and the cave's natural draft would carry smoke out through whatever opening provided the air circulation he had felt. Alternatively, he could route a chimney pipe out through the cave entrance, though that would be more complex. Window placement would be unconventional. The cabin would need to face the cave entrance to capture available daylight. Windows on the sides or back would be pointless, opening only to stone walls. But one or two well-placed windows on the entrance-facing wall would provide adequate light during daylight hours. The walls and roof of the cabin could be lighter construction than typical frontier cabins because they wouldn't be fighting extreme temperature differentials. The primary purpose would be creating a defined living space within the larger cave environment and providing a secondary layer of insulation. The cave itself would do the heavy work of thermal regulation. Thaddeus sketched plans on a large piece of birch bark. A rectangular cabin, 12 feet wide, 14 feet deep, 8 feet tall at the walls, with a peaked roof rising to 10 feet at the center. Traditional log construction using peeled and fitted logs. A stone fireplace in the rear corner, a door centered on the front wall, 2 windows flanking the door, simple but functional. He calculated materials. Approximately 60 logs for walls and roof structure, 500 to 600 river stones for the fireplace and chimney, clay and sand for mortar and chinking, a door constructed from split planks, window shutters, and oiled paper for window coverings. All materials were available locally. The timeline would be significant, 2 to 3 months of work, possibly longer, but the result would be a shelter that fundamentally solved the survival problem that had killed Ephraim. Thaddeus made the mistake of sharing his plan with Jasper Flint. He had convinced himself that other trappers would see the logic immediately. The mathematics were undeniable. The thermal advantage was measurable. Any reasonable man would recognize the innovation's value. He rode to Jasper's cabin in late February, carrying his notes and measurements, prepared to explain his discovery. Jasper listened politely while Thaddeus described the lava tube, presented his temperature measurements, and outlined his construction plans. When Thaddeus finished, Jasper was silent for a long moment. Then he began laughing. It started as a chuckle, but built into genuine, sustained laughter that brought tears to Jasper's eyes. "You want to live in a cave," Jasper said when he finally caught his breath. "Like a bear. Like some kind of animal. You want to haul logs into a hole in the mountain and build a cabin where no sunlight reaches, where you cannot see the sky, where rock might fall on your head while you sleep. This is your solution to staying warm." Thaddeus tried to explain the temperature differential again, but Jasper waved him off. He understood the measurements, he said. He simply thought the whole enterprise was insane. Men lived under open sky. They built cabins in clearings where they could see threats approaching, where they had access to water and timber, where they could tend trap lines efficiently. Living in a cave was regression, not progress. It was giving up freedom for safety, trading the mountain man's independent life for the existence of a burrowing creature. Furthermore, Jasper continued, caves were dangerous. Stone fell, ceilings collapsed, animals denned in caves, and would not appreciate human occupation. The darkness would drive a man mad over a long winter. The isolation would be unbearable, and what would other trappers think? The mockery would be relentless. Thaddeus would become a laughingstock throughout the territory. Thaddeus argued that survival mattered more than pride, but Jasper would not be convinced. He suggested in a tone that mixed concern with condescension that Thaddeus was still affected by Ephraim's death. Grief could make a man think irrationally. Perhaps Thaddeus needed more time before making dramatic decisions about where and how to live. The conversation ended badly. Thaddeus left Jasper's cabin frustrated and angry, but also shaken. Was he thinking clearly? Was the cave idea actually sound, or was he fixating on an impractical solution because he was desperate to feel like he could prevent future tragedies? Over the next 2 weeks, Thaddeus encountered 3 other trappers during his travels. He mentioned his plan to each of them, carefully explaining his reasoning. All 3 reacted with variations of Jasper's response. They thought he was eccentric at best, unstable at worst, One suggested he might want to return to civilization if mountain life was becoming too difficult. Another joked that he should just hibernate like the bears until spring. The mockery stung, but it also hardened Thaddeus's resolve. These men were accepting freezing and danger as inevitable because they could not imagine alternatives. Their ridicule came from unwillingness to question traditional methods. Thaddeus decided he would build his cave cabin regardless of what others thought. March brought the first hints of spring, though snow still covered the high country in deep drifts. Thaddeus began hauling materials to the lava tube. The work was grueling and slow. Each log had to be cut, limbed, stripped of bark, and dragged by horse through the canyon to the cave entrance. The canyon floor was rough terrain, studded with volcanic boulders and fallen timber. Progress measured in single logs per day felt maddeningly slow, but Thaddeus maintained steady discipline. He started with foundation work. The cave floor was relatively level but composed of loose volcanic sand and gravel over solid basalt. Building directly on this surface would allow settling and shifting. Thaddeus needed a stable base that would support log walls without movement over time. He spent 5 days clearing and leveling a 12 by 14-foot rectangle 100 feet inside the cave entrance. The location provided distance from the entrance's temperature fluctuations while maintaining enough ambient light during daytime hours to make the space livable. He removed loose material down to solid rock, creating a shallow excavation approximately 6 inches deep. Next came stonework. Thaddeus gathered flat basalt rocks from the canyon, selecting pieces that could be fitted together with minimal gaps. He hauled these stones into the cave using a canvas sling, making dozens of trips over the course of a week. The physical labor was exhausting, but the cave's stable temperature made the work far more tolerable than it would have been in open winter conditions. He laid the foundation stones in a careful pattern, fitting each piece like a puzzle. Gaps were filled with smaller rocks and packed volcanic sand. The goal was creating a level, solid platform that would distribute the cabin's weight evenly across the underlying bedrock. He used no mortar at this stage, relying instead on precise fitting and compression to lock the stones in place. The foundation rose approximately 8 inches above the cave floor, creating a raised platform that would keep the cabin's wooden elements away from ground moisture. Volcanic caves tended to be dry compared to limestone caves, but Thaddeus wanted no contact between wood and potentially damp sand. The raised foundation also provided a psychological benefit, creating a clear boundary between the natural cave environment and the constructed living space. He checked level constantly, using a water-filled wooden trough he had constructed for this purpose. The trough was 4 feet long, with transparent end sections. Water settled perfectly horizontal, allowing him to see if his foundation surface deviated from true level. He made adjustments, adding or removing stone, shimming with flat pieces, until the entire foundation platform showed level in all directions. The foundation work took 3 weeks. Another trapper would have rushed the job or skipped it entirely, but Thaddeus understood that everything built afterward would depend on this base being absolutely solid and level. Poor foundation meant walls that would not sit properly, doors that would not hang straight, structural problems that would compound over time. When the foundation was complete, Thaddeus stood back and examined his work. The stone platform was square, level, and stable. It was ready to receive the log walls that would transform this measured rectangle into shelter. Log selection and preparation consumed the entire month of April. Thaddeus rejected any log with excessive taper, significant knots, or irregular grain. He wanted uniform diameter, straight length, and wood that would season without warping. Pine was abundant, but too soft. He chose Douglas fir from higher elevations, trees that grew straight and tall, with minimal branching in their lower sections. Each log was cut to 14-foot length for the side walls, or 12-foot length for front and back walls. He stripped bark completely using a draw knife, revealing the pale wood beneath. The stripping process was tedious, requiring hours per log, but bare wood allowed tighter fitting and eliminated the irregular surface that bark created. Hauling logs into the cave required ingenuity. The canyon approach was too narrow for a horse to drag full-length logs without the timber catching on rocks and trees. Thaddeus built a simple sled from smaller logs lashed together with rawhide. He could load one stripped log on the sled and pull it with his horse through the canyon to the cave entrance. From there, he manhandled each log the final 100 feet to the building site. By early May, he had 30 logs staged inside the cave, enough to begin wall construction. He started with the first course, placing logs directly on the stone foundation. The foundation's level surface meant each log sat perfectly horizontal without shimming or adjustment. He notched the corners using a saddle notch technique, cutting semicircular depressions in the bottom of each log that would fit over the log below. The notching required precision. Too shallow and the logs would not interlock securely. Too deep and structural strength would be compromised. Thaddeus worked slowly, cutting each notch with a sharp axe, testing the fit repeatedly, shaving away thin curls of wood until the connection was tight. As walls rose, he discovered an unexpected advantage of building inside the cave. Weather never interrupted work. Outside, spring meant unpredictable storms, rain, snow, and wind that could halt construction for days. Inside the cave, conditions remained constant. He could work in shirt sleeves regardless of conditions outside. His tools never rusted from moisture. The logs themselves seasoned in stable humidity rather than swelling and shrinking with weather changes. The walls climbed slowly, one course per 3 days as he cut, fitted, and notched each log into place. Between each course, he packed a chinking mixture he had developed from cave clay mixed with horsehair and pine pitch. The mixture was more sophisticated than typical mud chinking, designed to remain flexible while providing excellent seal against air movement. By June, the walls stood 7 feet high. The structure was beginning to define space within the larger cave environment. Standing inside the partially completed cabin, Thaddeus could envision the finished result. The cave's rough stone walls formed a protective shell around the smooth log construction. The contrast was striking. Ancient volcanic rock surrounding fresh-cut timber, nature's architecture sheltering human craft. The psychological effect was profound. Inside the cabin within cave, Thaddeus felt layered protection, 2 barriers between himself and the outside world's dangers and temperature extremes. The fireplace and chimney presented engineering problems unlike anything Thaddeus had tackled before. A standard cabin chimney vented directly to open air above the roofline. His chimney would exhaust into an enclosed cave space. If he miscalculated ventilation, the entire cave could fill with smoke, making both cabin and cave uninhabitable. He spent a week studying the cave's natural airflow. He lit small fires at various locations and watched smoke movement. The pattern was consistent. Smoke rose toward the cave ceiling and drifted slowly toward the entrance, eventually finding its way out through the main opening. The cave also had secondary ventilation, small fissures in the rock ceiling that allowed air exchange. He could feel faint drafts near these openings. The discovery was encouraging. The cave had natural draft, pulling air from deep interior toward exits. If he positioned his chimney correctly, it could exhaust into this natural flow, and the smoke would clear without accumulation. The key was understanding that the cave itself functioned as a giant chimney with multiple exit points. Thaddeus designed a fireplace for the cabin's rear corner. He gathered river stones from a creek 2 miles away, selecting flat pieces that could be stacked with stability. Each stone was carried individually into the cave, a process that took days. He needed approximately 400 stones for the fireplace and chimney structure. The firebox was built 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 3 feet high. Large enough to burn substantial logs, but not so large that it would waste heat. He lined the interior with the flattest stones, fitted tightly to reflect heat forward into the room. The back and sides were built from larger, irregular stones mortared with clay. Above the firebox, he constructed a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge that prevented downdrafts and reflected rising heat back into the room. This feature was common in well-built fireplaces, but rarely seen in frontier construction. Thaddeus had learned about smoke shelves from a mason in Ohio years earlier. The principle was sound. Rising smoke hit the shelf, spread horizontally, then was drawn upward by the chimney draft above. The chimney rose from the smoke shelf at a slight angle, leaning back toward the rear cabin wall. At the ceiling, the stone chimney penetrated the roof structure Thaddeus would build later. Above the roof, the chimney would continue upward approximately 4 feet, exhausting smoke well above the cabin's interior space into the cave's natural ventilation current. He mortared each stone carefully, using clay mixed with sand and water. The mortar needed time to cure, so he built the chimney in sections, allowing each day's work to harden before adding more weight above. The process was methodical and slow, but the result was a solid structure that would withstand years of heating and cooling cycles without degradation. Testing the draft became his obsession. Before completing the chimney, he lit small fires and observed smoke behavior. Adjustments were made to the flue angle and opening size until smoke rose cleanly without backdraft or spillage into the room. The roof construction began in late June. Thaddeus could have built a simple flat roof since the cave ceiling protected the structure from rain and snow, but he chose a peaked design for 2 reasons. First, the angled roof would shed any moisture that might condense on the cave ceiling and drip downward. Second, the peaked design created a small loft space for storage. He constructed a ridge beam from a single straight fir log, 12 feet long and 10 inches in diameter. This beam would run the length of the cabin, supported at each end by the front and back walls. Getting the ridge beam into position required a makeshift pulley system using rope and a block he had carved from hardwood. He raised the beam incrementally over 2 days, securing it finally atop notched supports built into the end walls. From the ridge beam, he laid rafters at 18-inch intervals. Each rafter was a smaller log, 6 inches in diameter, notched to sit securely on both the ridge beam and the top wall logs. The angle created a roof pitch steep enough for water to run off, but not so steep that the interior loft space became unusable. Across the rafters, he laid split planks hewn flat on one side. The planks overlapped like shingles, each course covering gaps in the course below. He pegged the planks to rafters using wooden dowels whittled to precise diameter. Over the planks, he spread birch bark in multiple layers, creating a waterproof membrane. A final layer of packed clay sealed everything, though he knew this roof would never face serious weather. The windows required careful thought. Thaddeus positioned 2 openings on the front wall, flanking where the door would be installed. Each window was 2 feet wide and 18 inches high, placed 5 feet above the interior floor. The height provided light while maintaining privacy and structural integrity in the wall. He framed each window opening with hewn planks mortised into the surrounding logs. The frames were tight, leaving no gaps where drafts could penetrate. For the windows themselves, he constructed shutters from split planks reinforced with crosspieces. The shutters were hinged on the interior using leather straps, allowing them to swing inward. Behind each shutter he stretched oiled paper across the opening. The paper was nearly transparent, allowing diffused light to enter while blocking wind. He tacked the paper to the interior frame using small wooden strips, creating a seal. The combination of shutter and oiled paper gave him control over light and ventilation. Shutters open, maximum light. Shutters closed, complete darkness and full insulation. Standing inside the nearly completed cabin with both shutters open, Thaddeus was surprised by how much light reached the interior. The cave entrance was 100 feet away, but enough daylight reflected off the stone walls to illuminate his workspace adequately during midday hours. Evenings would require lamplight or firelight, but the daytime visibility was better than he had anticipated. The cabin was becoming real: walls, roof, windows, fireplace. It was beginning to feel like shelter rather than construction. On July 14, 1843, Thaddeus installed the door and declared the cabin structurally complete. The door was his final major construction task, built from thick planks fitted with tongue and groove joints. He reinforced it with diagonal bracing on the interior and hung it on iron hinges he had purchased from a trading post 60 miles away. The hinges had cost him nearly a week's worth of pelts, but the investment was worthwhile. Leather hinges would rot. Iron would last decades. He built a simple latch mechanism using a wooden bar that dropped into brackets mounted on the door and adjacent wall. From outside, the door could only be opened by lifting the bar through a small slot, a technique that provided security against both animals and unwanted human visitors. With the door in place, the cabin was enclosed. Thaddeus swept the interior floor, removing wood chips and construction debris. He built a sleeping platform along one wall using split planks supported by log brackets. A simple table and 2 stools completed the furnishings. The interior space measured 12 feet by 14 feet, providing 168 square feet of living area, small by conventional standards, but adequate for one man. The moment of truth came in the evening. Thaddeus laid a fire in the new fireplace using kindling and small logs he had stored inside the cabin. He struck flint to steel, caught the spark in charcloth, and blew gently until flames appeared. The kindling caught. Fire grew. Smoke rose into the chimney and disappeared upward. He watched carefully for any backdraft or smoke spillage into the room. The chimney drew perfectly. Smoke rose cleanly, pulled by the draft he had engineered into the flue design. Within minutes, the fire was burning steadily with no smoke visible in the cabin interior. Thaddeus sat on one of his stools and felt heat begin to radiate from the fireplace. The stone firebox absorbed warmth and reflected it into the room. The cabin's small volume meant the space heated quickly. Within 20 minutes, the interior temperature had risen noticeably. He checked his thermometer. Cave ambient temperature, 49 degrees. Cabin interior with fire, 62 degrees. A 13-degree increase from a modest fire. He added 2 more logs and waited. After an hour, the cabin interior measured 70 degrees. Comfortable warmth achieved with a fraction of the firewood his old cabin would have required. The implications were staggering. In winter, starting from the cave's stable 48-degree baseline, he could maintain interior comfort with minimal fuel. No more burning through cords of wood in desperate attempts to keep temperatures above freezing. No more waking to ice on the inside walls. No more risk of freezing to death in his sleep. Thaddeus spent that first night in his new cabin. He kept the fire small, just enough to maintain pleasant warmth. The stone walls held heat, radiating it slowly back into the space, even as the fire burned down to coals. The silence was profound. No wind, no creaking logs fighting temperature stress, just stillness and steady warmth. Thaddeus spent the autumn of 1843 running trap lines and preparing for winter from his cave cabin. The transition from his old exposed cabin to this sheltered existence revealed advantages beyond temperature control. The cave provided security that conventional cabins lacked. A single entrance meant he could defend the space easily. The stone walls were impervious to anything short of explosives. No bear or hostile raiding party could break through volcanic rock. The stable environment also protected his supplies. Furs stored in the cabin's dry interior remained pristine, free from the moisture damage that plagued exposed cabins. Food supplies neither froze solid nor rotted from humidity swings. Tools stayed rust-free in the constant conditions. The cave's darkness even deterred rodents, which seemed reluctant to venture deep into the tunnel. By October, Thaddeus had accumulated what he considered adequate firewood for winter. 20 cords stacked in the cave near the cabin entrance. Other trappers would have considered this quantity dangerously insufficient. Jasper Flint typically stockpiled 60 to 70 cords, but Thaddeus's calculations suggested 20 cords would be more than adequate, possibly excessive. November brought the first serious cold. Snow fell heavily in the high country. Temperatures outside the cave dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Thaddeus monitored conditions with his thermometer, recording data that confirmed his predictions. Outside temperature, minus 18 degrees. Cave ambient temperature, 47 degrees. Cabin interior with small fire, 68 degrees. The differential was exactly what his spring measurements had suggested. The cave's thermal mass was protecting him from the extreme cold, and his cabin's insulation captured and held the modest heat his small fires produced. He burned approximately 4 logs per day, sometimes fewer when he was active and generating body heat, sometimes 6 logs on the coldest nights when he wanted extra comfort. But even the higher consumption rate was a fraction of what he had burned in his old cabin. The quality of life inside the cave cabin exceeded his expectations. The constant temperature meant he could work inside without heavy clothing. He processed furs, repaired equipment, and prepared meals in relative comfort. The fireplace provided adequate light in combination with a single oil lamp. The space felt secure rather than confining. December brought a cold spell that would have been life-threatening in his old cabin. Outside temperatures plunged to -30 degrees and stayed there for a week. Thaddeus heard later that several trappers had abandoned their cabins temporarily, moving to lower elevations to escape the brutal conditions. Inside the cave cabin, Thaddeus barely noticed the extreme cold. The cave temperature dropped slightly to 45 degrees, but the change was minimal. His cabin interior remained comfortable at 65 to 70 degrees, with fires no larger than cooking fires. He slept soundly, worked productively, and consumed firewood at the same modest rate he had maintained all winter. January of 1844 brought weather that old-timers would talk about for decades. A massive Arctic front settled over the Rocky Mountain region and refused to move. Temperatures dropped to levels rarely seen even in the high country. -40 degrees became normal. -50 was recorded at some elevations. The cold was so intense that it killed trees, freezing sap inside trunks until the wood split with sounds like rifle shots. Thaddeus ventured outside only when absolutely necessary. The air at those temperatures was dangerous. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Breathing the frigid air burned lungs. Even his thickest furs provided inadequate protection for extended exposure. He checked his trap lines when he could, but many days he simply remained inside, accepting that he would lose trapping opportunities rather than risk freezing. The cave cabin performed flawlessly. Outside temperatures reached -48 degrees on the coldest night. Cave ambient temperature, 43 degrees. A 91-degree difference maintained naturally by the Earth's thermal mass. Inside the cabin, Thaddeus kept his fire burning steadily, maintaining interior temperatures around 68 degrees, comfortable enough to sleep without multiple layers of blankets, warm enough to work without gloves. His firewood consumption remained modest, 6 logs per day during the worst of the cold, 8 logs on a few particularly brutal nights when he wanted extra warmth. Even at this rate, his 20-cord supply was lasting well. He calculated that he would finish winter with approximately 12 cords remaining, an enormous surplus compared to his previous winter's desperate wood shortage. The psychological difference was profound. In his old cabin, winter had been a siege. Every day was a fight against cold, a constant calculation of firewood remaining versus days until spring. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by cold that penetrated blankets and forced him to rebuild fires in the middle of the night. Work was nearly impossible because his hands were too cold for fine tasks. Now, winter was merely a season. The cold existed outside, irrelevant to his daily life. He slept soundly, he worked comfortably, he cooked proper meals instead of hastily prepared food eaten near the fire. The cabin was not just warmer, it was a fundamentally different quality of existence. On the night of January 23rd, when the thermometer outside registered -52 degrees, Thaddeus sat at his table in shirt sleeves, writing notes by lamplight. The fire in his hearth was small, barely more than a large cooking fire. The cabin interior measured 71 degrees. He was comfortable, safe, and warm, while outside conditions were killing animals and making travel impossible for less prepared men. He thought about Ephraim, frozen to death despite a roaring fire. The memory still carried pain, but now it also carried validation. Ephraim's death had not been meaningless. It had driven Thaddeus to question assumptions, to seek solutions, to build something that solved the fundamental problem of winter survival. The cave cabin was Ephraim's legacy as much as Thaddeus's innovation. Outside, wind howled through the canyon. Inside the cave, the air was still. Inside the cabin, warmth and silence prevailed. The pounding on the door came just after dawn, on February 6th. Thaddeus woke instantly, disoriented by the unusual sound. No one visited the cave cabin. Few trappers even knew its exact location. He grabbed his rifle and approached the door cautiously, calling out to identify the visitor before opening. The voice that answered was barely recognizable. Murdoch Rafferty, a Scottish trapper who worked territory about 15 miles north. Thaddeus knew him slightly, had traded with him once or twice. They were not friends, but they maintained the cordial relationship common among men who shared dangerous work in isolation. Thaddeus opened the door. Murdoch stumbled inside and nearly collapsed. His face was gray, his lips blue. Ice crusted his beard and eyebrows. His hands were wrapped in cloth that looked inadequate for the brutal cold. He was shaking so violently that he could barely speak. Thaddeus helped him to a stool near the fireplace and built up the fire immediately. He pulled off Murdoch's frozen outer layers carefully, checking for frostbite. The man's fingers were pale but not blackened. His feet were in worse condition, the toes showing the waxy appearance that indicated freezing. Thaddeus packed snow around the frozen extremities, knowing that slow warming was critical to preventing permanent damage. Gradually, as warmth penetrated Murdoch's core, the shaking subsided enough for him to speak. His story came out in fragments. His cabin had become uninhabitable 3 days earlier. The extreme cold had revealed every weakness in the structure. Gaps between logs had widened as the wood contracted. Chinking had fallen out in chunks. The door had warped, leaving a half-inch gap that let wind pour through. His firewood supply had run critically low because he was burning massive quantities just to keep the interior above freezing. On the night of February 3rd, his cabin interior had dropped below zero despite a fire large enough to be dangerous in the confined space. He had realized that staying meant freezing to death. He had made the desperate decision to travel, hoping to reach lower elevations where conditions might be survivable. He had heard about Thaddeus's cave cabin from another trapper. The description had sounded insane at the time. Building inside a cave seemed like the act of a man who had lost his mind. But facing death from cold, Murdoch had decided that insanity might be his only option. He had set out before dawn, traveling through darkness because waiting for daylight might have meant freezing before he could leave. The journey had nearly killed him. 15 miles in -40-degree temperatures, breaking trail through snow, fighting wind that cut through every layer of clothing. He had fallen twice, struggled to rise, forced himself to keep moving because stopping meant death. He had found the canyon more by luck than navigation, followed it to the cave entrance, seen light from Thaddeus's window, and used his last strength to reach the door. Murdoch stayed in the cave cabin for 3 days, while his frostbitten feet healed and outside temperatures remained dangerously low. The experience transformed his understanding of survival infrastructure. On the first day, he was simply grateful to be alive and warm. By the second day, he was asking detailed questions about the cabin's construction and the cave's thermal properties. By the third day, he was calculating how quickly he could build his own cave shelter. Thaddeus showed him the temperature differentials with his thermometer. Outside, -38 degrees. Cave ambient, 44 degrees. Cabin interior, 69 degrees. Murdo stared at the numbers, watching Thaddeus's small fire, comparing it mentally to the enormous blazes he had maintained in his own cabin while still freezing. The firewood consumption impressed him most. Thaddeus estimated he would use approximately 1.5 cords per month during the coldest part of winter. Murdoch had been burning 2 cords per week and still losing the battle against cold. The efficiency was not marginal, it was revolutionary. Murdo examined every aspect of the construction. The stone foundation, the careful log fitting, the chimney design, the window placement. but he understood that the cabin itself was secondary. The cave was the primary innovation. The cabin was merely a well-built structure taking advantage of the cave's natural thermal stability. When temperatures moderated to -15 degrees, Murdoch prepared to leave. His feet had recovered sufficiently for travel, though he would carry frostbite scars permanently. Before departing, he asked Thaddeus if there were other lava tubes in the region. Thaddeus described 2 he had seen during his explorations, both within a day's travel of Murdoch's current trap lines. Murdoch left with detailed notes about construction techniques and a completely changed perspective on winter shelter. The mockery he had shared with others about Thaddeus's cave dwelling now seemed foolish. Living in a cave was not regression, it was intelligent adaptation to environmental conditions. 2 weeks later, another trapper arrived at the cave cabin. Duncan Holbrook, a friend of Murdoch's who had heard the story. He came not seeking refuge, but seeking information. He wanted to see the cave cabin himself, to verify Murdoch's descriptions, to understand the principles before attempting his own construction. Thaddeus welcomed him and spent a day explaining the concept, the cave's thermal mass, the stable temperatures, the reduced firewood needs, the construction techniques that maximize the natural advantages. Duncan took extensive notes, asked intelligent questions, and left convinced that he would search for suitable caves before the next winter. Word spread through the trapping community faster than Thaddeus had anticipated. Men who had mocked him 6 months earlier were now seeking his advice. The brutal winter had killed 2 trappers in the region and left several others with serious frostbite injuries. The survivors were receptive to any technique that improved their odds. Thaddeus shared his knowledge freely. He had no interest in keeping secrets or claiming proprietary rights. His goal had been survival, not fame or profit. The winter of 1844 to 1845 saw the first wave of cave cabin construction. Murdoch Rafferty found a suitable lava tube 18 miles north of his old cabin location and spent the summer building a structure similar to Thaddeus's design. He made modifications based on his specific cave's dimensions and his own preferences, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged. Cabin inside cave. Leverage natural thermal stability. Minimize firewood consumption. Duncan Holbrook discovered a large cave system in the mountains east of the main trapping region. The cave was not a lava tube, but a limestone formation with similar thermal properties. He built his cabin in a chamber that maintained year-round temperatures around 52 degrees. His construction took longer than Murdoch's because the limestone cave required more extensive floor leveling, but the result was equally effective. A trapper named Lemuel Cross heard about the innovation from Duncan and sought out Thaddeus in the spring of 1845. Lemuel was older, in his late 50s, and struggling with the physical demands of winter survival. He was considering leaving the mountains because he could no longer cut and haul the massive quantities of firewood required for traditional winter heating. The cave cabin concept offered him a way to continue trapping for several more years. Thaddeus helped Lemuel locate a suitable lava tube and advised on construction details. Lemuel's cabin was smaller than the others, built for one person with minimal storage needs, but it incorporated all the essential principles. By October 1845, Lemuel was installed in his cave shelter, confident he could survive winter without the firewood logistics that had nearly defeated him. The adoption remained quiet and practical rather than dramatic. There was no sudden revolution in mountain cabin construction. Most trappers continued building traditional exposed cabins because suitable caves were not universally available. The geology had to be right. Lava tubes or deep caves existed in certain volcanic or limestone regions, but were absent in others. Trappers working granite mountains or sedimentary terrain had no access to the natural shelters that made the innovation possible. But in regions where appropriate caves existed, knowledge of the technique spread through informal networks. A trapper would mention it to another during a chance meeting. Someone would visit one of the cave cabins and see the advantages firsthand. The information passed from person to person without fanfare or formal documentation. By 1847, approximately a dozen trappers in the northern Rocky Mountain region were living in cave cabins during winter months. Some maintained traditional cabins for summer use and retreated to cave shelters when cold arrived. Others, like Thaddeus, made the cave their permanent residence. The technique saved lives in measurable ways. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was nearly as brutal as the winter of 1843 to 1844. Several trappers in traditional cabins died from cold or abandoned the mountains permanently. Every trapper in a cave cabin survived comfortably, with minimal hardship. Thaddeus Merrick left the mountains in the spring of 1848. The fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in many regions, and changes in fashion had reduced demand for beaver pelts dramatically. Men who had spent decades in the wilderness were finding their livelihood disappearing. Some transitioned to guiding settlers or hunting for meat. Others simply left, seeking new opportunities in a rapidly changing West. Thaddeus sold his remaining furs and equipment, packed his personal belongings, and rode west to the Oregon Territory. He was 39 years old, still strong and capable, ready for a different kind of life. He had saved money during his trapping years, enough to purchase land and start a small ranch near the Willamette Valley. He married in 1850. Constance Wheeler was a widow with 2 young children, a practical woman who had traveled the Oregon Trail and built a life in frontier conditions that matched Thaddeus's experience. They settled on 160 acres, raised cattle and horses, and built a conventional farmhouse with wooden walls and a shake roof. The house was comfortable, but unremarkable. Thaddeus never mentioned to his neighbors that he had once lived in a cave. The mountain years became a distant memory. Thaddeus's children grew up knowing their father had been a trapper, but the details of that life remained vague. He told stories occasionally, editing out the hardship and danger, presenting the experience as adventure rather than the grinding difficulty it had actually been. He never mentioned Ephraim's death. He never explained why he had become obsessed with cabin construction or what he had learned about thermal engineering through necessity and observation. In 1868, a visitor arrived at the ranch. Lemuel Cross, now in his 80s, had traveled from Montana to see Thaddeus one final time. The 2 men sat on the porch of the farmhouse and talked about the old days. Lemuel reported that the cave cabins were still in use. New prospectors and hunters had discovered the abandoned structures and recognized their value. Some of the original cabins had been maintained and improved. Others had fallen into disrepair but still stood as evidence of the innovation. Lemuel told Thaddeus that the technique had spread beyond their original region. Trappers and prospectors in Idaho, Wyoming, and even Northern California had heard about cave dwellings and built their own versions. The exact number was unknown, but Lemuel estimated at least 30 such structures existed across the Mountain West. Several lives had been saved over the years when people caught in unexpected winter storms had found cave cabins and sheltered until conditions improved. Thaddeus listened quietly. He felt satisfaction but not pride. He had solved a problem that was killing people. Others had recognized the solution's value and adopted it. That was sufficient legacy. He had no need for recognition or credit. Lemuel left the next day. Thaddeus never saw him again. 3 years later, in 1871, Thaddeus died quietly in his sleep at age 62. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone listed his name, birth, and death dates, and identified him as a loving husband and father. Nothing about mountains or caves or innovations that had saved lives. But in the volcanic regions of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, the cabins remained. Built into lava tubes and sheltered by stone, they continued providing warmth and protection to anyone who needed them. The innovation outlived its inventor, preserved not in books or records, but in the enduring practicality of structures that solved fundamental problems of survival. Thaddeus Merrick had built something that mattered, and that was enough.